non-sequiturs in my tutorials is more squirrel. Let's blending. Okay, we're going to try to do a tutorial, or I'm going to try to do a tutorial on an inventory in Blender. I'm going to use the video texture to change the textures because it's not as heavy. Basically, if you have a scene and you're loading it, like an overlay scene for an inventory, the more objects it has in it, the longer it takes to load. This extra load time only happens once. But when you first open up an inventory, or when your player first opens up his inventory, and it takes 5 minutes to load it, even if it only happens once per playtime, that's annoying. So, rather than using a whole bunch of objects and just changing the mesh, we're going to use textures. And as you can see, I already have a bunch of materials on here that make them invisible. And there are some annoyances with textures, materials, objects, meshes, and other things in Blender. Basically, the Blender devs decided sharing is caring, which is actually okay, but let's break it down. All the copies of an object in a scene, if they're copied in from another layer, they're all treated as different objects. They can all have different object colors. They might also be able to have different materials if you could change the materials, but as far as I know, you can't directly change the materials. You can just change the textures in the materials. So, here's where the tricky stuff starts. If they're all sharing a mesh, then if you change something on one mesh, it changes it for all the meshes. This includes vertex colors, probably materials, which I believe are attached to the mesh. You could probably attach them to the object itself instead. Textures on those materials, and I believe shape keys. But I don't use shape keys that much anymore. So, another thing, if they're all sharing the same material, even if they're not sharing the same mesh, if you change the texture on one material, it changes the textures on all the materials. And the coup de grace. If they're all sharing the same texture, and you change one texture, even if they all have different materials with different names and different objects and different meshes, guess what happens? Yes. It changes the textures on all of them, which means that you have to juggle a bit to get around this. Mostly by having a copy of the same object multiple times with different materials and different textures. For an inventory, that's not bad, but for characters, that's an annoyance, because then your whole file gets extremely heavy. Now, this may seem like a horrible thing that the Blender devs should fix, but I'm used to it, and if they fix it, I will bludgeon them with a whack-a-mole, or any other non-existent item that I can safely threaten to bludgeon people with. Because the interesting thing is, let's say you have a whole bunch of trees. They'll have to change their leaves because it's going from summer to fall in your map. Rather than either changing the mesh or having a script on all of those objects to change all of those materials, you can have on your map a cube with a material on it and just change that one texture. Boom. All the trees are changed. Which actually makes running a massive scene with a bunch of trees really light if you have to change everything all at once. Now you might think, well, that's only good in a few small situations. But sometimes you want to make a scene-wide change on something. Let's say the player beat the crap out of an enemy, and all of a sudden, the entire scene has to change its textures or something. All across the scene has to change their textures. Let's say you have a door, it's red, it's locked. Now they all have to change to blue to show that they're unlocked. Well, you can change one door, and it changes them all. Now you might be saying, well, why not use object colors? Well, that's a nice workaround. You can have a whole bunch of characters with the same material and have them all use object colors to look completely different. But that's pretty much all you really need to know about materials and changing them around. If you're wondering, I'm using headphones as a microphone, and they're around my neck because that's the loudest. So, if you are having problems, you can always go to Blender Artists forums. Most of the people there are really nice. Some of them even answer questions. Hey, how about that? And as long as you give a clear description of your question, and maybe a source file for them to look at, they'll help you out. Let's see. Another thing you can do, but make sure first to search for your question, just in case it's been answered. Another thing is you can go on YouTube. This guy, the Timester, has 9 ways to optimize your game in BGE, the Blender Game Engine. This includes, in GLSL, turning some of these things off. I can pretty much turn all these off. Now, shaders, this handles pretty much the shaders. Like Lambert and Cooktor, Toon and all that. If you turn it off, it gives it a nice soft look, but there's no specularity. But if you turn these off, your game will run faster. Color management will, if you turn it off, make things a bit darker. If you're not using shadows, turn the shadows off, all that stuff. There's a whole bunch of good stuff. Another thing to notice, you probably, maybe, already noticed this. I have bitmaps turned on. Let me show you what bitmaps are. In the user preferences, under system, yay, you turn bitmaps off and on and off and on. If you turn them off, you get sharper textures, more pixely, and things can run a bit faster. If you turn them on, they're smooth, things don't run as fast, but if you're running a small game, it's no biggie. Now, this inventory system is kind of broken. I have this. Okay, that's with bitmaps turned on. The reason why I have 2 swords is some stuff's still sharing some stuff. It's annoying. So let's turn bitmaps off. Hey. Now, as you noticed, when the materials were changed and we stopped the game, everything was transparent. Sometimes the material changes carry over. You can just do this to get them back. I did not know this. Okay, bitmaps turned off. Yeah. If you change the material textures, bitmaps get turned back on. That's another annoyance. And if you're wondering, those swords, those sword textures, oh, they're awesome. I believe they're 8x8 textures. Yeah, I do everything really small. XNView MP, a good image viewer, because it's free. Anyway, that, with bitmaps turned on, becomes that, which actually looks pretty cool, considering it's 8 by 8. Yeah, I roll that way. Okay, so yeah, Blender textures and materials kind of have a few failings, but there's a few workarounds. Now, I thought that they had fixed the physics, but I still fell through a mountain. I might make a tutorial about falling through mountains later. But what you want to do is make sure that everything has a different texture. Now, what I thought I could do, yeah, there, you can see them. What I thought I could do was just make a new or make it generated, but then they wind up sharing the same image and it gets to be a pain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to create a new folder. Call it empties and I'm going to create a whole bunch of copies of that and rename them and reapply them. But make sure that everything that's going to show a separate texture has a separate mesh, material, texture, and texture image. So, I'm going to stop it here, do what I have to do, and then we'll come back and pick up.